Okay, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to NCSN's first webinar. My name is Matt Galley, I'm one of the board directors here. I'm very excited to have with me Paul Johnston at the end, and Tony Blockley in the middle of us from Johnston and Blockley. I don't know if you'd just like to give a quick introduction of yourself, Paul?
Yeah, good afternoon, I'm Paul Johnston. I'm a retired police officer. I was in West Yorkshire Police for 32 years. Majority of which involved in major crime investigation. And for the last 10 years of my time there, I was a senior investigation officer investigating homicides. Sadly, many of them were domestic homicides. And I finished up being the head of the homicide, a major crime review team, and then head of CID. When I retired, I went to Northern Ireland and for 5 years investigated homicides over there that had occurred during the Troubles there, which was where I met Tony.
Okay, and Tony?
Very similar. Good afternoon. Tony Blockley, a similar career path as Paul, as a homicide investigator and finished as the head of crime within Derbyshire. I left Derbyshire and then went to Northern Ireland, as Paul said, where I met him, reviewing the deaths attributable to the Troubles. And then since that, we've started doing a lot of work in relation to domestic homicide reviews. I'm also involved with a domestic violence charity within Derbyshire and the vice chair of their management committee. And then on top of that, I do some lecturing at Derby University within the criminology.
That's great, thank you both. So this is our first webinar on what we hope will be a programme over the next 12 months. And Tony and Paul are both members of NCSN. So if you'd like to be on our panel or indeed suggest a subject, please get in touch with our office. The details are on our website. And we'd like to start off by giving kind of an overview of domestic homicide review, and then we'd like to divert to taking your questions about what it is about domestic homicide review which is troubles you most and what it is you'd like advice on. So you can type into the chat message box on the webinar link you've received this morning. So I'll hand over now back to Tony and Paul to give an overview of DHR.
Well, DHR, as everybody no doubt is aware, domestic homicide reviews came into force in 2011, and they've been conducted throughout the United Kingdom, or sorry, throughout England and Wales, with regard to homicides in domestic settings. I mean, I can give quite a wide range of thoughts and views on it. It might possibly be easier to see if we can address some of your specific concerns rather than me talk about what they are and why they're there. I'm sure everybody knows that. But it's more addressing some of the specific concerns and actually some of the things that we want to sort of suggest to you as partnerships that might ease the burden or indeed make it cost effective. And we've got some sort of thoughts and ideas that we're quite happy to share with you around that.
Okay, I'll start us off with some questions which we've had submitted, just while you the attendees get familiar with the system, and it might take some time to find out how to type into that. Some of the questions we've had sent into the office were, on average, how long does a domestic homicide review take to complete?
Well, they can vary, and for those people that have conducted domestic homicide reviews, the guidance will talk about 6 months from start to completion. But there is a process to suspend the domestic homicide review pending the outcome of any criminal litigation. So quite often it can, there can be a 12-month gap from starting to actually getting towards the completion or recommencing the process. But I think on average it probably, if you take that into account, it probably takes about 18 months from start to finish. If you took out the criminal investigation side, that would probably boil down to the 6 months, which is the requirement from the Home Office.
Okay. Still no questions from anybody in the audience, so if they could start typing with whatever they'd like to know, that would be great. It is just on the screen in front of you under the chat option or the questions option. Until then, I'll continue with the questions you had coming to the office. Somebody's asking, what is the average cost of completing a DHR? Kind of, overall, from start to finish, including all staff costs.
Sorry, well, some community safety partnerships adopt sort of a tendering process. procurement process. Others will typically just telephone someone that they know who's done a similar piece of work before and ask that individual to either chair the domestic homicide review or produce the overview report that goes to the Home Office eventually, or do both. Because it's a tendering process, we're not au fait with how much other people charge, obviously, for the process, because that's confidential information, and I wouldn't really want to discuss sort of our arrangements with community safety partnerships that we've worked for. But I think it's generally accepted that it's not just about the amount of money they pay for the process, it's about opportunity costs that are lost when people who've got day jobs within the community safety partnership and the respective agencies involved are actually taken away from their daily responsibilities to participate in what is a crucial activity. And there's no way of knowing really how long the review is going to take, as we've just described there, or how many agencies are going to be involved in the actual process and the level of their involvement. So it really is sort of up in the air as to how much it costs. But there are ways that we think, anyway, those costs can be kept to a minimum.
Okay, excellent. We've had our first question from the audience from Catherine Peters. And Catherine asks, as a rule of thumb, what is the minimum length for a personal, intimate relationship that the Home Office have deemed a DHR is necessary?
Well, I'm not aware of any guidance which says what is the minimal length. I think it's got to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And I think the difficulty is if you say it's, for example, if you said it was 6 months, then 6 months and a day, or 5 months and 30 days. So there isn't. But I think there's a judgment has to be made by the partnerships to look at the information that was available, look at the information in terms of any domestic violence and history, and actually look at the potential lessons learned in terms of the length of time that a personal relationship could take place. And it may well be, of course, that a personal relationship has only been taking place for a week, but those individuals were involved in previous violent relationship or abusive relationships. So there are still lessons to be learned from the history of their relationships rather than that actual single relationship.
Okay, anything about Paul? Or?
No, there is nothing in the guidelines to say how long the relationship should be or what actually constitutes really an intimate relationship. There are obviously familial relationships as well. But I do think Tony's absolutely right there. You've got to look at each case on its merits, and I think it's pretty obvious to anyone looking at it whether it was an intimate relationship or not, and to err on the side of caution. Because this is all about trying to learn lessons, and even if it's not immediately obvious that there are lessons to learn, maybe there's a case of raising awareness about domestic issues and that sort of thing, domestic violence issues. So I think most community safety partnerships would err on the side of caution and say, well, there's clearly a relationship there. We don't know how long it's been going on or to what level it was, but there's a sort of duty on us to have an examination of that and just see exactly what the situation was.
So would that mean that you both feel that there's no need to have a guideline there for the length of time a relationship has been established, or do you feel that there is need for such a thing?
I think the difficulty is if you set a guideline, if you set a set time scale, there are some people that will fall in and fall out of that time scale. And actually you might fall out of the time scale, but there's some very significant lessons to be learned from reviewing that, the involvement of agencies in that. So I think there's a real danger of saying it is set at 3 months or it is set at 6 months. I think the reality is that the more and more of these that you do, then it's quite easy to sort of say, well, actually, yes, we think, our advice would be, yes, we think there should be one because of these particular reasons.
Okay, a follow-up question from Catherine then. Where a serious case review is underway, would this tend to suggest that the DHR issues would be covered by the serious case review?
The serious case review, yeah, absolutely, and there is a crossover in the legislation between 16 and 18 around serious case reviews, and serious case reviews take precedence. I'm not sure that the lessons or the questions asked in the serious case review are the same as domestic homicide reviews. and having been involved in both, the domestic homicide reviews tend to be broader ranging and not addressing specific issues. So I'm not sure that they would be, but having said that, I think you await the outcome of a serious case review and then have a look and see if there's any responsibility or need to do a domestic homicide review.
Okay, Paul, anything to add? Or
No.
Okay. Another question from Louise Ashby in the audience has asked, who pays for the domestic homicide review? Is it the council or is it shared by the partners?
I think it's shared by the partners, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. I do know that it's responsibility of the local authority, if you like, but how that's divvied up within the Community Safety Partnership, I don't honestly know.
Can I just add, and I think this is, a point that Paul alluded to earlier was around keeping costs down in the way that the domestic homicide reviews are funded, and a number of authorities will charge a day rate, and they will ask for both the chair and the author to commission on a day rate, and then there's expenses, etc. There's a real value, and something that we particularly do is charge a flat rate. So we would say we will conduct this domestic homicide review from start to finish at this cost. That's what it'll be. It matters not how many meetings we come to, how often the report is amended, how many reports there are. We just do a flat rate. I suppose the analogy is a builder. You either pay, I want this extension and this is how much it's going to cost, or see how long it takes and then I'll pay you at the end. This is about getting value for money from a partnership. So I think having a flat rate or a flat set rate to conduct the DHR from start to finish and any remedial work that may need doing, I think is probably the way forward for partnerships.
Okay. Any more questions from the audiences would be brilliant. We've not got any at the moment, so I'll continue with the ones we've had here in the office. Our next one was, who is responsible for ensuring a DHR is undertaken where there is no budget to conduct a DHR?
Well, the responsibility fairly and squarely rests with the Community Safety Partnership once they've been notified by the police that a homicide has taken place. They've got a month to notify the Home Office of their decision whether to hold a domestic homicide review and to justify why not if they've chosen not to conduct a review. But the responsibility fairly and squarely rests with the Community Safety Partnership as written in the legislation.
Okay, anything to add, Tony, or does that answer?
No, I think that answers it.
Okay, our next question was, what other agencies are involved in the domestic homicide review? So I presume that means BAR, the kind of those Community Safety Partnership.
Well, the agencies are anybody that's had contact with the victim or perpetrator within that period of the review, and there can be many and varied, from charitable organisations, third sector, voluntary sector, and of course statutory bodies. One of the things that we have identified, and I think this is something for partnerships to consider, is where a commissioned service who was involved with a victim or perpetrator no longer exists, and what happens to those records. And one thing that we strongly advise partnerships, if you commission the service, then you should take or retain the records of that commissioned service if there is in light of any future review, and that would be a domestic homicide review or a serious case review. So from a partnership point of view, it's important to think about the future consequences of an organisation not receiving funding or being decommissioned in effect. So I think it's important for partnerships to retain those records.
Okay. We've had another question from Louise. What are the benefits of having a separate chair and report author, or what are the kind of arguments against having such figures within a DHR? And one example she's given is of cost.
Well, the usual practice that appears to be adopted these days is to have the same individual chairing the DHR and producing the report. It's actually something I favour, although I do know that areas have two separate individuals doing that. I personally feel that if you're chairing the process, you become really involved in it, and whilst you're actually doing that, you're formulating in your mind just how the report's going to look when ultimately it's written, and I think there's a good sync there. But I do know that some areas, as I said, much prefer to have a separate chair and a report author, but I think it's a matter for them.
And I would add in again around the cost. You know, to do the chair and author is going to be probably at a reduced cost than having a separate chair and a separate author. And certainly when Paul and I do reviews, and we chair and author a number of reviews, you know, we charge a fixed rate, and that's for both aspects of it. So, you know, it boils down to the fact that you know what you're getting, and I think that's really important, particularly with constricting budgets.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Another question we've had is, what are the pitfalls of domestic homicide review, and how could you avoid those going into one? Are there any pitfalls that those conducting them should be aware of? Any ones which come up frequently?
Well, I think there are a number, and I think firstly it's about establishing the domestic homicide review and how it's going to work, and I think it's important to set that out at the very commencement of it. One of the things that certainly we do is that we like to get out the authors together and explain the process and give them a complete understanding of what's expected in the reports. One of the reasons purely is because the work that they're doing, we try and make sure that they only do it once, as opposed to having to go back and make amendments. So, you know, we deliver a short session on this is what the role is, this is what's expected. So when they actually submit the report, it's the best that it can be. And what we also do is, and I think this is important to ask of both your chairs and authors, is that they're available. We certainly make ourselves available in terms of ongoing support throughout the process. And this is part of that full package, that you get the ongoing support, telephone and face-to-face support wherever that's needed. Because again, it's about making sure that the time you spend on the process is both effective and efficient.
Anything to add, Paul? Or?
Well, I think a pitfall potentially is when you have parallel processes. Obviously, if there's a criminal investigation and there's going to be a trial, coronial process as well, is making sure that you conduct the review in such a way as that you're not going to risk compromising that process. So again, something that we're very, very keen on is to involve the police senior investigation officer in the domestic homicide review process very, very early on. And we try and encourage them to come and actually give the panel a briefing, not just about the circumstances of the actual homicide itself, but also we find it very helpful if they were to identify very early on potential witnesses, either for the prosecution or for the defence, so that when people are conducting their own sort of individual examinations to produce their individual reports, they don't inadvertently speak to someone who could potentially become a prosecution or a defence witness.
Okay, we've got another question from the audience from Tony Kenya. Would you recommend authors presenting their reports direct to the panel in person or not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that goes without question that they should present it. But don't forget, these reports aren't the author's reports; they're the panel's reports. So, it's an evolution, if you like. The process goes through a number of stages, but actually the report belongs to the panel. It might be, you know, if I was the author, I've written it, but actually it's your report. And there may be some criticism within it, you know, which are just and appropriate, but ultimately it's the panel's report. So the panel are involved at all stages of the report, and definitely presenting the report. I would be hugely surprised if a report author just submitted it and didn't present or be available to the panel meeting. That would be, as far as I'm concerned, extremely bad practice.
Okay, anything to add?
No.
Does that answer that one for you? Another question we've had in the office is, what is the ultimate goal of the domestic homicide review? And once that's been established, what is the takeaway from that? And how do councils and community safety partnerships use that in future?
Well, the ultimate goal is to learn lessons to prevent a similar set of circumstances, or to prevent domestic homicides. But it's also learning lessons for agencies moving forward. And I would suspect that, well, certainly everyone that we've been involved in, there have been lessons learned, and it's formulated an action plan and then delivering those actions. And part of that is around raising awareness and making sure that people are aware of what they do and what they don't do specifically has resulted in or has contributed to the circumstances that have led to the death of an individual. So it's about taking those lessons away and actually understanding them. But I think it's about making sure, and again for us this is about making sure that the lessons are articulated in such a way to be meaningful. And as an example, it's very easy to write, deliver more training. Well, that means your training is probably wrong in the first place, and actually you should revise and review your training and make sure the training that you deliver is the most effective and efficient in terms of your resources. So it's not always about doing more, it's sometimes looking about what you do and actually refreshing what you do.
And of course the report, when it's finalised, is actually published by the Community Safety Partnership once the Home Office have authorised that to happen. And there is an action plan that accompanied it, and it's the responsibility of the Community Safety Partnership to ensure that the action plan is fulfilled.
You mentioned training to me. Is there training available for those conducting domestic homicide reviews, or is it something that people are kind of expected to know from their own experience of how to go forward and conduct one of these?
There are a number of as I said, we deliver training, and I know there are other people that deliver training as well, and this is, so for example, we deliver training around raising awareness for the general workers around what a DHR is and what the expectations are, and it's also to do with preparatory acts. So, for example, make sure record keeping is conducted in a proper and appropriate way, and there's the effective policies in place around that. And then there's some training delivered around IMR authors, because that is quite a specialised area in terms of the critical analysis, and more often reports can be submitted that don't contain critical analysis, which then means that the reports have got to be rewritten. So addressing those issues very early on. There is a training package within the Home Office website, which is on an electronic package, but there is no national training guidelines regarding domestic homicide reviews.
Is that something you think should be brought in? Is that something that should be beneficial?
Personally, I do, and I think that there are a number of things that need to be done. One is delivering a national training package, very similar to CARDA around IDVAs and CARDA dash risk assessments. So I think it is important to set the standard and set the benchmark, and also around accreditation. And I think that's really important as well, that people conducting these reviews on your behalf are accredited to an appropriate standard. What I would say is that there is no accreditation process within the Home Office, but I suppose a lot of that is about, have you had reports accepted and published, and the Home Office only give two, they're either acceptable or not acceptable, we've had quite a number now of reports published, and certainly the last one was commended, so we're quite proud of that fact. But the reality is there is no accreditation process.
No, and because I think it's largely because there's no accreditation process. Certainly, feedback we've received from community safety partnerships is that there's quite a disparity in the way chairs, in particular, go about conducting the domestic homicide review. And to give an example, we particularly favour involving the family of the victim as much as we possibly can in the review. Because I think that's the only way you can actually view things, or the closest way you can view things, from the victim's perspective, through the victim's eyes, which is what the review should really all be about. And I do know that some chairs don't share that view, and I think there should be a sort of a national guidelines, if you like, from the Home Office, preferably saying, well, actually, we consider that important or not important, or whatever, so that we start getting a bit more consistency up and down the country. And incidentally, again, it's our practice to share our final report with the family before it's actually submitted to the Home Office, because often we find that they want just something maybe taking out sometimes, or more often than not want to include some particular facet of the case that's not been in the public domain through the criminal process or anything like that.
Okay, that's great. We've had 2 more questions from the audience, so please keep sending those in. Both of these are from Tony and follows up to kind of what we've just been talking about. His first one is there any guidance for dealing with the disclosure of third-party material dealing with the SIOs, which I presume is Senior Investigating Officers, and disclosure officers?
Yes, there is, and it will be under the criminal proceedings, the CPIA Act, and I suppose because of our policing background we're aware of that and we have the knowledge and experience. But as Paul said earlier on, by involving the SIO at a very, very early stage in the review and being part of that review process, they understand the material that is obtained. But that's also one of the reasons that the process is suspended during the criminal process, because actually, you know, what this review doesn't want to do is start to cut across any criminal or the criminal justice process. So there isn't any specific guidelines within the Home Office guidance regarding third-party disclosure. But I think it's important that either somebody within your panel or indeed your chair or author have an intimate knowledge of disclosure, and certainly third-party disclosure, because it could impinge any criminal justice outcome either at the time or indeed in the future.
Okay, anything to add, Paul?
No.
Okay. Tony's next question was, how can the Community Safety Partnership be responsible for implementing the action plan, which is presented at the end, when they have no governance or authority over most partners within the CSP?
Well, I think it's a valid point, but actually all the partners sat around the table are signed up to this. The action plan is a combination of individual agencies' action plans, and it goes through the governance board, and it's the governance board that should sign off the report. And if the governance board is signing off the report, this is the partnership governance, then they're taking responsibility and ownership for the action plan. So as a consequence, you know, there has to be a monitoring. If you complete all this work, all this time and this effort, and you know, say on the death of somebody, and produce an action plan to improve services, and then don't complete the action plan, then I think there is something sadly wrong with partnership working, but also with individual agencies who've sought to disregard what they found within their review.
Another question from Catherine Peters. What point should the victim's family be involved? Should this be after the Home Office QA panel is made aware? And what is the best form of liaison with the family? Should this be through the chair?
I think it should be through the chair, but the timing of it is difficult because no two homicides are alike and no two families are alike. And again, I think it's something one would take advice from the police senior investigation officer as well. It may well be that some the victim's family members, one member, however many, may actually potentially at least be either a prosecution or a defence witness, for example. My personal view is that when the terrible thing has happened and the family are absolutely devastated, they've got the police knocking on the door, they've got the National Homicide Service knocking on the door, they've got family liaison officers. My personal experience is actually they don't need yet another body, someone they've never heard of, making more and more demands on them. So what I would seek to do, and this is our preferred way of doing it, I have no specific guidelines around it, is we, again through the senior investigation officer, ask the family liaison officer, the police family liaison officer, to at least let the family know that there is going to be a domestic homicide review, invite them to contact us in the first instance if they feel up to that. But generally speaking, I wouldn't start the process in earnest with the family until after the criminal proceedings.
Anything to add, Tony?
Well, I think part of the question was around how do you communicate with the family, and I think one of the things is that we try and make that link through the family liaison officer, as Paul said. But of course, once the criminal justice process is finalised, then the family liaison officer will have an exit strategy and leave that family. So what we will always do is write to the family explaining what we do. We supply literature around what a homicide, domestic homicide review is for, and try to make contact with that way. I think it's really important to get the balance right. It is important to involve the family, and it is important to offer them that involvement, but it's not to harass them. they seek to choose. I mean, we certainly write to them on one occasion. We'll make the contact through the FLO if we can. If not, we write to them directly, and we would then offer a second letter once the review has been completed to say, look, we've done the report, it is completed. If you'd like to see a copy of it or you'd like to discuss it, then please make contact. And as Paul said, it has to be through the chair and the report author. It shouldn't be through anybody else.
I think it's also, sorry Matt, it's also important to stress that it's not just family, it's friends as well, of the victim in particular. And also sometimes employers who are often able to give quite a bit of background about what was troubling the victim beforehand, communications between the victim and the perpetrator and that sort of thing. So again, largely through liaison with the senior investigation officer, it's often the case that we'll focus our attentions on family, friends and employers, and they do tend to, more so than family members sometimes, make themselves available to the review.
Okay, just following on from that, Paul, what is the guidance, or I know we've established there's no kind of official guidelines for these, or at what point do you stop kind of reaching out to people involved in that? Can you talk about speaking with employers and friends? Are the people who you just wouldn't approach, maybe neighbours or people who they dealt with a few years prior to this? Is there any guidelines for that?
I think it's again a case-by-case issue, but certainly some of those we've been involved in, we've gone back quite a way in time. It just depends on the individual circumstances. There have been occasions also when we've just about thought we had finished with a review, and then a family has chosen to engage with us, and as I said, friends as well, and that inevitably will delay the process. But I think it's important to delay it for that purpose, because ultimately you want it to produce as round a report and as in-depth a report as you possibly can.
And I think this is, partly this is about ensuring that the victim has a voice. And that's one of the principles of doing a review, is that every bit of information is possible or is available to the review, and actually it can be conducted and contained within that report. And of course, linking that back into cost, if you're on a day rate, then that's going to, there is almost a perverse reason for the people conducting the review to keep finding people, because it's a continuous payment. And which is why we say that, this is the cost, this is what it's going to be, and it's irrespective of how many people or how long it takes. So I think that's really important from a partnership to really consider.
Okay, we've got another question from Tony Kenyon. Have you had any experience of lack of engagement or cooperation from other bodies, for example, NOMs, the coroner, and the CPS?
The simple answer is no. Sometimes one has to G up a particular organisation, but I find that it's not really a desire not to cooperate. Sometimes it's a lack of knowledge about the DHR process and what it entails and what it's actually designed to achieve. I think the only occasion really where we've had a particular difficulty, and Tony alluded to it earlier on, was when an organisation no longer exists. And then the issue is, well, where is the documentation, and actually who is going to have access to it and produce a report from it. We've actually resolved that by finding it ourselves and going and looking through it ourselves. But certainly I haven't experienced any out-and-out deliberate sort of thwarting of the process, if you like, by any organisation.
Anything to add to anything?
No.
If one of those partners, kind of worst case scenario, was not to cooperate, how would you deal with that? How would you approach them to engage more and provide the cooperation you need?
Well, I haven't encountered it, but I think often it is just a case of sitting down with an individual who represents that organisation and explaining the importance of the process and actually what it is that we're seeking to achieve from this, to actually prevent future victims. And I really can't envisage a situation where someone would deliberately stop you from seeking to do that. And I think sometimes there is a question about money as well, particularly if it's a small voluntary organisation. Actually producing their own individual review written by someone who's had no direct line management responsibility for the person in that organisation who had contact with the perpetrator or victim is not an easy task. and the money has to come from somewhere. So I can understand why there might be some reticence, but there are ways around that.
I think as well it's important to recognise that this is a statutory responsibility, and statutory organisations have that responsibility. You know, that's what they are there to do, and they have to fulfil their obligations, and this is one of the many obligations that they have to fulfil. So it's important to recognise that. But actually, if information was being withheld or not provided, then, you know, as part of the review process, you would put that in the report. And that's not to fall out with people, but that's just to demonstrate to organisations that you are quite prepared to say, you know, you should have done, but you haven't. I think it's easier if you've got an independent chair and author to be able to do that, because you've still got partnership working to continue and exist and develop post this review, and just, you know, that would be an absolute worst case scenario and last minute and the ultimate thing that you could do. But you know, why would you not do that? I think it's important to recognise that that is the ultimate sanction, I guess.
Okay. We've had two more questions from the audience, both from Louise Hasby. And her first question is, how do you decide the length of time for the chronology for the IMR? I've heard it needs to be done in Excel, or it is a nightmare to merge chronologies in due course.
Well, there's two ways, and there is a system called Chronolator, but that comes at a cost, and there are some licensing issues around that. And there is, and I know a number of partnerships have created an Excel spreadsheet and use that. I think it's important to get the chronology absolutely right, because it tells a story, and it tells a story that nobody can sort of hide or manoeuvre out of. And an Excel spreadsheet, and it can be quite simple. Certainly, I can think just off the top of my head, 5, probably 6 columns at the maximum, standard information, standard formatting, so that they can all be merged. But it is important to get that right, because the difficulty is, of course, when it's not done right, whoever is receiving the chronology has to do manual input, and that's not right. But again, this is part of that original briefing that we spoke about, getting people together, getting the authors together and say, right, this is the chronology, this is how you need to complete the documentation, and this is the formatting that has to take. Do not alter it. And actually on receipt, if they have altered it, then send it back and say, look, you know, this is how it's got to be, please redo it.
Anything to add on that?
No.
Okay. And Louise asked another question was, do GPs have to share information?
Yes, they do. Well, the health do. It depends what information it is you're sharing. Obviously, there's an issue around confidentiality, but actually, there's often a lot of information in GPs. Now, they're not part of the statutory responsibility or the statutory organisations that are named in the guidance, but certainly that they have a duty. My personal view is that they have a duty in terms of patient care and future care. And I know that the NHS certainly encourage GPs to share information, as do NHS England, and they're all part of the, you know, we've certainly done reviews with both of those, and GPs have been involved. I think it's very important to be specific about the information you're requesting. You're not requesting medical information. What is information concerning any domestic violence or domestic abuse, or issues that may have been misidentified.
I think one of the recurring themes that's been identified from past domestic homicide review has been around GPs and their lack of sharing of information. And I do know that there's been quite a training program generated as a result of that about awareness raising for GPs. So certainly in the more recent ones that we've been involved in, we've had no criticism whatsoever around the input by GPs. So I do think the message is getting across there.
Okay, and it's kind of a follow-up to that. Does domestic homicide review have the authority, I presume is the word, to kind of override all confidentiality agreements such as those as part of the GP, or maybe any other type of agency within which might be involved?
I don't think it has the authority. It doesn't have the authority to override confidentiality. But I think what we often say, confidentiality isn't secrecy, and it's how you share information and for what purpose. And actually, if you're sharing information specifically under the remit of a domestic homicide review, there's a management process that goes with it. Community safety partnerships will have a broad-ranging information sharing agreement with agencies, and actually it's how you manage that. So, as an example, we share information within our panel, which is only right to do. But what we are very strict on, and we get our panels to sign a confidentiality agreement, is to say that the panel is not to share this information outside of that particular room or that particular meeting. They can share their own individual organisation's information, but not information belonging to another agency. And that has to be built on a basis of trust in terms of the way that you operate. But partnerships share massive amount of information on a daily basis. If you take the MARAC process as an example, very, very sensitive information is shared amongst the partners. And so it's no real difference to that.
And it's a good example of why the report is the report of the panel, not the author, because until it's signed off by every panel member representing each of their organisations and they're happy with the information contained in the report, it doesn't go anywhere. So there is that sort of catch-all at the end of the day, that safety net, to ensure that private, confidential information that shouldn't go beyond the panel doesn't actually go.
Okay, we've had another question from Tony Kenyon, and this goes back to the question we had about disclosure. Tony says, I've adapted the guide for the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, local safeguarding children's courts to assist with the liaison and the exchange of information when there are simultaneous Chapter 8 serious case reviews and criminal proceedings. April 2011 guidance to provide a procedure to deal with requests from the SIO for third-party material. Have you had any experience of this? Let me know if you'd like to repeat, because that's quite a long one, that.
Yeah, well,
so we do it again.
Thank you.
Let's start again. So Tony has adapted the guide for the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, local safeguarding children's courts, and that was to assist with the liaison and the exchange of information when there are simultaneous Chapter 8 serious case reviews and criminal proceedings.
Mm-hmm.
April 2011 guidance to provide a procedure to deal with requests from the SIO for third-party material. Have you had any experience of this?
Well, of all the ones that we've done, Tony, no, we haven't had any requests for it, because actually the information that is around the table is more often than not known to the police. I think one of the important things, and it's really important to get the SIO or a representative of the criminal investigation sat at the review panel, because there may be information that comes out of a review panel which is not known to the investigation and actually which is relevant to the investigation. And if that does come to light, then that would be investigated in a normal manner from a policing perspective. So I've not specifically had that around third-party disclosure, but because they are present and part of the meeting, then if they do pick up on any specific issues, then they're able to follow that up appropriately.
Okay. Tony says he asked that question because he was just wondering if other authorities are using it for DHRs. Louise has asked, there is so much to do in the first month. Is this timeline essential? Has anyone been pulled up for missing the month's deadline?
I'm not sure about the term pulled up. I am aware that on occasions it's been missed slightly. But yeah, it is a pretty tight time frame. But really all we're asking for in that first month is a decision whether to hold a review or not, and to notify the Home Office. Once the decision has been made, we're going to do that, then it's over to the chair to sort of get the ball rolling and make decisions with the panel as to whether they're going to suspend the review until the outcome of the criminal proceedings or not. But I mean, there are guidelines, you know, and most people do try their best to adhere to it. But I've found that if you're having issues, some communication with the Home Office is all that's required to sort of give yourself a little bit more time if you require it, providing you know why you're doing it and why you're asking for a little bit more time.
And I think, if I may, that's the important issue is, why is it going to take longer than a month? And if it's just because you can't be bothered, that sounds awful. If it's just the fact that you can't pull people together for a meeting, or they're busy doing something else and that kind of stuff. Well, the Home Office might have something to say about that, but if there are some genuine reasons why you can't achieve that deadline, then it's just a matter of articulating them. And as Paul says, they're guidelines, and whilst you're endeavouring to do it within a month, sometimes it's just not achievable because of some of the complexities or the issues that are within that domestic homicide review.
Yeah, and I do find the Home Office quite practical around this, and not onerous at all. But it is about communication, I think. I think what they don't like is nothing. You know, there's been a domestic homicide review, and we've not heard from that community safety partnership. But I don't find them particularly. I think they're generally quite switched on, if I'm honest. And as long as people are notifying them where the process is and notifying them in advance of any potential delays, I don't think there's a problem at all.
Okay, and where would DHR, the decision is taken for it not to go ahead, what are the kind of reasons that may happen? Are there specific ones? Are they kind of ones which come up time and again? Or is it one, kind of, I suppose it's case by case, isn't it?
I think it is case by case. I'm certainly aware of one where there'd been a substantial gap in the relationship. There'd been a 15-year gap in relationships, and they'd only just got back together, and then sadly he murdered the victim, and it was a decision not to do one on that specific case. But it might also be, of course, that there are no services that know anything about this couple. So a couple could have been living together for many years, never involved any single service whatsoever, and then this murder takes place, the homicide takes place. And actually, what lessons are ever going to be learned from that? Because there is no involvement. So I think you're absolutely right, Matt. It is on a case-by-case basis, and there's something around being a bit pragmatic and using a common sense approach as to whether you should have one or not.
Yeah.
But having a real understanding of why you're saying we're not going to have a DHR for this reasons, and relating it back to the fact that there are no lessons that can be taken from it.
Okay.
Of course, the onus is on the partnership to articulate the reasoning to the Home Office. And the Home Office, if they disagree, can compel the Community Safety Partnership to conduct a domestic homicide review. So that there is sort of oversight of the process. But again, my experience is that more often than not, Community Safety Partnership will conduct a domestic homicide review, even if there's nothing obvious there in the first place. Because it might well be that the issue is around raising of awareness of domestic abuse, which could be picked up from the DHR, even though there was no involvement with any organisations beforehand.
Okay, we've had quite a few questions from the audience come through just while we've been discussing that. Back to Tony Kenyon. Have you had any cases where the CSB has decided not to publish the DHR because of adverse effects on the welfare of the children involved? If so, how did the Home Office QA panel respond to that?
Yes, we have. Sometimes around the children, but also some around the sensitivities of what's contained in the report. And the Home Office QA panel have been very supportive of that because we were able to articulate why the report shouldn't be published. We've also conducted a number, Tony, where we've done two documents, a public-facing document and then a confidential report to the Home Office, because a lot of the material in the document is very sensitive to the victim and perpetrator and, of course, any surviving children. So that is not at all ever for public consumption. But it's important that the Home Office understand all the information in order to make a judgment about the public-facing document. So yeah, there are plenty of examples of that.
Okay, and this is kind of a question for myself, really. Whilst DHR is being conducted, obviously, is it kind of public knowledge that's being done at that time? And if so, if the media get hold of it, how do you deal with that at all? Are there any kind of cases you've had or you know of where the media got hold of it and kind of derailed the DHR itself through kind of too much reporting? Or?
I can think of an occasion when the media were told about the DHR process by the family and then made an approach to myself, actually, as the chair for comments. But, the sort of media response has got to be the Community Safety Partnership's response. And what we did on that occasion was all sat down and decided on a sort of a media strategy involving the family. and their choice was actually, can we just wait until the report is finalised before anyone has anything to do with the media? And again, I find, I mean, a lot of dealings with the media, obviously, a major crime investigation over the years, and I find that providing you're open with them and saying, well, look, for this reason, let's finish the review. Once we've done that, we'll agree a strategy and then we'll talk to you. Generally speaking, they find that acceptable, particularly if it's the family's wishes.
Okay, more questions from the audience. Lost my place. So Catherine Peters asks, going back to making the decision about whether a DHR should be conducted, what advice would you give on making that decision, and should this be with the CSP chair or a panel of representatives, and is there a danger of conducting a mini DHR in making the actual decision as to whether to proceed with conducting one?
But I think, to be fair, what you've got to do is evaluate the information that you have. And perhaps sometimes the only way you can do that is actually ask agencies to sit down and have a discussion about what information you hold. And there is no simple way of doing that. I'm not sure it's conducting a small DHR. I think it's more about just having a complete understanding and then a rationale as to why you are, or indeed in this case, why you would not be holding a DHR. Because I think it's important. I suppose from the Home Office point of view, the purpose of doing this is to prevent DHR, to prevent homicides, and also to learn lessons for the future. So actually any activity that could do that has got to be welcomed. But we also have got to recognise that there are occasions when a DHR is not appropriate. Some of those we've already mentioned.
And Catherine follows up with another question on that. When the CSP chair is the police commander, are there any difficulties in removing themselves from the criminal investigation aspects to take the decision?
I'm sorry, can you just read that?
Yeah, sure. This is a follow-up to your the last question we just had. And Catherine asks, where the CSP chair is the police commander, are there any difficulties in removing themselves from the criminal investigation aspects to take the decision?
Well, I suppose I'm not sure that, and this may be just peculiar in that particular policing area, but I'm not sure that the police commander would actually be the senior investigating officer in any event, and actually they would be independent from any criminal investigation. Having said that, if they are the senior investigator and the chair, then they've got to make a decision based on their professional position. And they may say, well, look, in terms of independence and transparency, I'm going to step away from this and let you make the decision. But just realise that I will support you whatever that decision may be. So I think that's on a very case-by-case basis.
Okay. And Louise Aspie has asked, back to the chronology, is there a standard length of time in which to ask for it?
Louise, how long is a piece of string? Unfortunately, I think if it's a relationship that has just been drawn together, then you might look at some significant event within that relationship. So 2-3 years, whatever that may well be. And certainly we have a very sort of a certain view on that. And actually, if there's events prior to the chronology, we may ask those to be provided in summary form. And actually, if that summary then produces some information that we need some greater sort of examination of, then we would return back to the author and say, look, we need this, and could you expand on this, and that kind of stuff. But there is no sort of set guidance as to how long it should be, or again, and it's the same with a lot of these. It is on a case-by-case basis. But I think both the chair and the author have got to be sensible and pragmatic about it. Is there any point in going back, for example, beyond 6 years? Because an organisation 6 years ago will not be the same as an organisation today because of the changes in policies and procedures and everything else. So will there be any lessons to be learned from 6 years ago versus today? And that would be a starting point. But as I say, it's got to be on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, and Tony Kenyon has asked, can a DHR be completed after the perpetrator has appealed and the appeal is pending?
Well, a DHR can be conducted at any stage. I mean, technically it could be conducted before the trial and sentence, but there are obviously difficulties around that and dangers around that with regard to disclosure, as we've already discussed. So it can be conducted at any time, absolutely.
Okay, and who has overall responsibilities to ensure the victims are notified?
That there's a DHR taking place.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's the chair that has the responsibility to do that, and you know, personally, I think it should be the chair and say, look, you know, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, you know, this is what we want to achieve from it, and we would certainly like your involvement and participation. So I think it's definitely down to the chair of the review.
Okay, and obviously we've got a general election coming up in the next 6 months. If this is a kind of change in power, is that going to have any effect on the DHR process? Will it be abolished completely, or will it, you know, still be in force?
Well, Matt, if you knew the answer to that, we could make a bet now, couldn't we, and make an awful lot of money. I think the reality is it's a statutory responsibility, so it would need a change of legislation and a change of law. And actually, why would we say we're going to stop doing it if there are lessons to be learned and preventing domestic homicides and improving services for victims? So I'm not sure. There may be some changes in arrangements in terms of funding and the way that the costing's done. There may be some changes in terms of how the process is conducted, but essentially I would imagine that the legislation will stay.
Of course, yeah. Okay, we're coming up on the hour now in terms of answering questions, so if you've got any more, please do send them in, because we'll be finishing shortly. I think both Tony and Paul have obviously demonstrated their wealth of knowledge on DHR, but can you tell us a little bit more about Johnston and Blockley and when it was when you founded it and the benefits people may find in working with yourselves as opposed to anybody else?
Could I just add something?
Yes, of course, feel free.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult to say that because there's a DHR process, lives have been saved. Because, I mean, how do you actually prove that? But I think it is fair and only right to point out that certainly in the time that we've been doing them, which is 3 years now, we have seen changes in the way some organisations actually conduct themselves. We've seen changes in some of the processes, their internal policies around safeguarding and around domestic abuse. And I was at a meeting only yesterday where there was an issue raised, and they were able to say, well, actually, as a result of a previous domestic homicide review, we've changed those processes and policies now. So if it was to happen again, we would do things differently. So it's very hard to say we've saved lives, but we're certainly moving in the right direction. Yeah. And I think the Home Office acknowledged that. Well, in fact, I know the Home Office acknowledged that. So any future government would be a little bit foolish, I think, to sort of remove that process.
Okay, we've had another question from Tony, so we'll come back to what I was saying about your company at the end. Tony's asked, any experience of dealing with parallel investigations such as SFOs and post-incident reviews? And then in brackets, health.
Yes, yes, we have, Tony, and one of the things that health obviously do is do a review, and obviously they're parallel reviews. And I think one of the challenges for health is a very broad agency. To just call it health is extremely broad, and actually what you can get in that is a number of different reviews. And I know what we've done in the past is said, well, if you're doing an internal review for a specific purpose, actually use that as the basis for your IMR, or indeed use the IMR as the basis for your internal review. And we also recognise the timescales involved in some of those reviews and adjust the timeline for the IMRs accordingly. So there are some challenges around that, and around individual agencies. And so it should be, but I think again, it goes back to the point we've made, is that this review process is not to be seen as adversarial. This is around a supportive process, which is aimed at getting the most from it. So, I think it would be wrong to sort of force any agency to say, no, we want it doing by this time next month or next, the next few weeks or whatever it may well be. It's about working together to ensure that the best outcomes can be achieved, and I think that's really important. part of the process.
Okay, anything to add, Paul?
No, again, my experience is that most agencies can't wait to get on with it, actually, because they don't know what's around the corner. And when they're told that there's an IMR due, sometimes it's just a question of, well, just slow down a little bit. There's judicial proceedings and there's no real hurry with this, but certainly no reticence or reluctance on part of most agencies to actually get on and do it.
Okay. Okay, just while we give everybody in the audience, another question. Do you think the criteria for establishing a DHR is being applied too strictly by the Home Office?
Well, I don't think it's been applied. I don't think it is too strictly. In actual fact, I don't think if the Home Office wanted to be strict about it, there'll be far more domestic homicide reviews, because actually domestic homicide doesn't say domestic murder, and the homicide is the death of a person. So actually, where there's been a suicide as a consequence of domestic abuse, either by the perpetrator or victim, one could argue that that should be a domestic homicide review. So that I think there are a number of cases that could or could not be, and if the Home Office were extremely strict about it, then it would be, yes, you must complete a DHR in these circumstances. So I think there's a deal of latitude being provided by the Home Office. But ultimately, as a partnership, then it's about the responsibility to prevent something happening in the future, and far better to prevent it than having to deal with the aftermath. So I think the purpose of them is absolutely right, and it's how that application is taken place, accepting, of course, that there is a cost with all of it.
Tony says you're just playing devil's advocate with that question.
Well, thank you for that, Tony.
I think we'll set a cut-off point in the next 5 minutes to get your kind of final questions, otherwise we'll probably be here all day. Just while those come through, could you tell us a little bit about Johnston and Blockley? As I was saying before, what is the benefit of using yourselves over another organisation to conduct a DHR?
We have the experience, I think, is the main thing. We've been involved in homicide investigation, and I know that's only one side of it, but nevertheless, I think the main advantage that gives us, particularly, is that we're used to dealing with families of the bereaved and have done for a lot of years, and knowing sometimes what to say and how to respond, but perhaps as others don't. But I think the main advantage for community safety partnerships is that we have the time to do it, and we're dedicated to do it. And whereas I do know that in the Home Office guidelines, it sort of advocates for potential one community safety partnership sharing another community safety partnership's DHR and vice versa. But again, our experience is that most of the people who would be doing that have got day jobs to do. And of course, when the onus was placed on community safety partnerships to conduct these reviews, it didn't come with an offer of cash to do it. So the money has to be found from somewhere within an environment of shrinking budgets, but also people's personal workloads are ever increasing. So I really do think, and it's not just Johnston and Brockley, but I think there is great value in the independence and perception of independence as well, by someone outside of the community safety partnership, whoever it is, actually doing the sharing of the review and producing the overview report.
I think, Matt, if I could just add, why would you select Johnston and Blockley? Well, firstly, as Paul says, we've got a vast amount, many years of experience dealing with families and dealing with homicides, and have been sort of experienced all manner of different scenarios. But we also have a very in-depth knowledge and experience around domestic violence and domestic abuse, and certainly around the causes and effects of that. Part of what the work we do is around delivering training, raising awareness around domestic abuse with agencies, and also some specialist service, the effect on children and that kind of stuff. So we actually come as a complete package in actual fact, and because we've done quite a number of homicide reviews, a lot of the stuff and a lot of the experiences that community safety partnerships are going through and the challenges, we're able to say, well, actually, in this case, let's do this and let's do that. And I think, and forgive me for harping on about it, but I think one of the real benefits is, if you wanted a domestic homicide review and Johnston and Blockley were going to conduct it, we would tell you how much that's going to cost from day one, and that's irrelevant or irrespective of how many meetings, how many reports, how many family members, how many friends that we needed to speak to, or indeed, any briefings, etc., etc. So, you get exactly what you pay for in terms of that. That's how we operate and how we think it should be done. And I think that's providing best value for community safety partnerships and best value for victims and preventing future victims.
Okay, excellent. We've had no more questions from the audience, so unless there's anything you both like to kind of finish up with, we will close there.
No, I think I will thank you, and I thank the people that have taken the time to ask the questions, because I think it's really important, and these are issues that are very relevant to them, and I think it's also important that we provide as much practical advice as we can, and to try and assist them in the future. And, that's what we've sought to do, and hopefully we have done.
No, absolutely, and just to add to what Tony said a minute ago, our responsibility, as we see it, doesn't finish the minute we've finished putting pen to paper and the reports submitted. We are always available to community safety partnerships and individuals within them to offer advice, and do so frequently, actually, even if we're not directly involved in that particular area or that DHR. We often give advice, for example, to authors of IMRs and that sort of thing, and quite happy to do that.
Okay, well then, on behalf of NCSN, I'd like to thank you both for giving me time today and coming into the office and speaking with our members. We've been recording this, so that'll be available. We'll send it out to you all. And finally, if you've got any feedback, we'd be very welcome to receive that over the next few weeks. Obviously, as I said at the start, we're looking to do a program of these. So if you have any ideas or suggestions, we'd very much like to hear them. So thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.